Ladies and gentlemen, it's the Gormon Productions Wrestling Podcast.
Good morning, good evening, or good afternoon to you, my friends, and thank you so much for tuning in to a special edition of the Gormon Productions Wrestling Podcast. What makes it special? We got the draft coming up next week. First time in a long time since we've had a draft and two separate brands, both Raw and Smackdown. Let's roll right into it. First thing we got to think about when we go into this draft is working our way backwards from SummerSlam. Meaning, if we're going to have two separate shows, we got to think about who's going into this pay-per-view. That way we know where our roster is going to lie. So the first thing we got to think about is who's coming out of Battleground with that title. I'm going to get into much more detail as to why I think this, but Dean Ambrose, I think, is going to most likely be going into SummerSlam as the champion. Here's why. That guy's not a transitional champion. I would find it very surprising if they were to give him that title only to take it away again. It would really discredit him, and I think that it would only probably fuel the fire if they were to give it back to Roman Reigns. I think Seth Rollins is someone that could come out of Battleground as the champion, but I think it would really taint Dean Ambrose's image, and I don't think they want to do that at this point because I think he's on a really nice upswing. So, with that being said, who would Ambrose wrestle at SummerSlam for that title? And here's what I think they're going to do. Not necessarily what I would do, but what I think they would do is throw him up against John Cena. Here's why. When they split Ric Flair from Charlotte, I think that opened up the opportunity for Rick to be used otherwise or elsewise. So when you've got John Cena coming up on tying Ric Flair for the championship reigns, I think it's very possible that they're going to put John Cena as a champion at SummerSlam, tying Ric Flair's record at 16. Because what needs to happen is that if John Cena ends up taking this record to 17, that needs to happen at a WrestleMania. And I think if Ric Flair is available for a different storyline, that's where they're going to put him. Just an idea, and that's what I'm going to go with for now. On the other side of the coin, are there going to be two championships now with the new roster? And something that I've noticed, and I read online after I even noticed it, was the verbiage that they're using to describe the championship. Because for the longest time, it was the WWE World Heavyweight Championship when they combined the two. But here recently, they've just been calling Dean Ambrose the WWE Champion, which could be a little hint, a little prelude to bringing back the World Heavyweight Championship. Did a little research. That belt was introduced in 2002 by Eric Bischoff. So you're talking a long time ago. And it wasn't until TLC in December of 2013 when we saw Cena and Orton go head-to-head for the new, more or less, undisputed championship. Now, I understand that, in between, we've had different undisputed champions before. We've had Chris Jericho, we've had the Brock Lesnar, the Undertaker, but always that belt, that championship was kind of in the picture. Here recently, they've kind of set it aside, haven't really thought about it, but they certainly didn't retire it. So it's entirely possible that you could see that belt come back. And it all depends on how they brand their pay-per-views. Is there going to be Raw pay-per-views? Are there going to be Smackdown pay-per-views? Is there going to be a champion going back and forth? Or will we have two distinct champions? Originally, I probably would have said, no, keep it one champion, but we have the talent that we could have two champions, and maybe down the line, we could merge them again. So who knows at this point? Other titles, I think obviously the United States Championship is going to stay in one place. Intercontinental Championship is going to stay in one place. I think that's a given. I think that something that would be very exciting, especially with this tournament going on, is the introduction of a Cruiserweight Championship. That could easily go on to a place like SmackDown where it's hot, it's fresh, it's live now. Or bring it over to NXT. Obviously the majority of those guys are your lightweight division, and I think it's time to reintroduce that championship. Tag team titles, don't think there needs to be two. even though we do have a surplus of tag teams, I think that could rotate back and forth. The women's championship, again, even though we have the largest women's roster we've had in a long time, a solid roster, I don't think there needs to be two, especially since they've just done this big push with that new title. Okay, moving on to another idea about logos and about packaging these shows, and I think that it is time to completely rebrand the show. I think it's time to, because admittedly, I think some of these logos are a little stagnant, and I think that we've had them for a long time. I think the intros are a little stagnant. I think this is the time to get a brand new look for each brand. And along with that, you're talking about your general managers who are going to be announced here soon. I've had a really hard time thinking about who Stephanie McMahon would choose because I can't think of an ally for her unless it's going to be somebody really annoying. Triple H makes sense, but he's far up higher on the ranks than a general manager would be, as the COO. So I'm not quite sure who Stephanie's going to pick. She could bring him in and kind of the authority refill, I guess, which would not be overly appealing. What I would love to see, and it's not going to happen, but I'd love to see Daniel Bryan be the general manager on Raw with Stephanie. The reason for that is just the heat between the two of them. Sometimes it's better when you have a GM and obviously now a commissioner kind of, going toe-to-toe with each other, not wanting to work with each other. It worked really well when you had the Bischoff and Paul Heyman and Stephanie McMahon kind of mix back during the original kind of draft era. And so I would like to see that. I don't think it's going to necessarily be what happens. There's a lot of rumors that Daniel Bryan's going to be the general manager on SmackDown, which would make significantly more sense. It's hot, it's fresh, it's new. Shane's in charge. He brings in somebody who the fans are going to go nuts for. It's so interesting. All of a sudden, it's like you have SmackDown and Raw and they're baby faces and heels. They're putting so much emphasis on SmackDown. It's going to be interesting to see how Raw is perceived. So rolling right into the roster of who's going where. I'm just going to list it down and tell you what I think would make sense. And the number one thing that I think is going to happen either the beginning of the show or the ending of the show is you got Finn Balor coming in. And I don't think that's going to be a surprise to anybody. I think that was very evident when they put him with Nakamura on a non-pay-per-view match. An awesome match, a great farewell for him. I think he's coming up the roster, and good for him. So, looking at Raw, if they're going to bring that World Heavyweight Championship back, what a better place to bring it back than Raw, because I think they're going to put an emphasis on the current championship going over to SmackDown with Shane. So let's look at the roster here for Raw. I would probably put Seth Rollins, AJ Styles, and Finn Balor as your main three guys, and what a better SummerSlam match than Balor versus Styles. Other members of the roster who are going to bring up a lot of really good matches. You got Bray Wyatt and the Wyatt family, because I don't think it's time to separate them just yet. I'd keep Enzo and Cass there as a tag team. I'd keep Gallows and Anderson there, especially if you do a Balor versus Styles match at SummerSlam. It's really going to help fuel that Bullet Club, or excuse me, the Club, since we are very PG now, kind of storyline, and so I think that's going to be really hot. I'd keep Ziggler there because everybody wants to see kind of like the Styles versus Ziggler, the Rollins versus Ziggler, kind of Finn Balor versus Ziggler. I'd keep the United States Championship there with Rusev. Cesaro, who I can only hope and pray can come up and grab a big championship here soon. Kevin Owens I'd keep there. Alberto Del Rio. Baron Corbin. Jimmy Uso. And notice I did not say the Usos, I said Jimmy Uso. The reason I say that is I think it's time to see who's Shawn and who's Marty in that group. And we're going to find out pretty quick. And then Xavier Woods, who I think they're going to split from the New Day here pretty soon. Or at least it seems like that's something that's going to happen, at least from the storylines on TV. So I guess we'll find out. Moving over to SmackDown. And we're going to start off with Brock Lesnar and Randy Orton. Now, are they going to have a lot of camera time? No. Orton might, Lesnar won't. But if there's anybody who arguably led the charge when we had the first brand split for SmackDown, it was Lesnar, and I think it would make the most sense to keep him on that show. Plus, that's, you know, so much hype is being focused on SummerSlam with Orton versus Lesnar, and I think that SmackDown is the great new platform to really promote that match. So I'd put those two up at the top. I'd get Dean Ambrose in there with that championship. I'd put John Cena on SmackDown. Everybody's focusing on that championship at the moment, and so if they really want to keep the attention on SmackDown, I'd keep them there. I'd put Roman Reigns in there. I'd put Sami Zayn and Chris Jericho. I'd bring over the Intercontinental Championship with The Miz, Sheamus. I'd put Kofi and Big E there as the Tag Team Championships, the Lucha Dragons, unless you split those two up, which is entirely possible. The Dudleys, the Vaudevillains. You can see a trend here with kind of the tag teams going into this one. Jey Uso, because again, I'd love to see those two in singles to see what they can do. Somebody like Apollo Crews would be a great first or second draft pick just because of the run he's on. Put him up against someone like Titus O'Neil and you have an awesome match. So those two guys would work great. I haven't looked to see where Neville is with his injury. Maybe I'll look that up here in a couple minutes, because he would be somebody who might be a nice surprise coming in as a draft pick. So right now, that's kind of where my head is thinking in terms of one side or the other. It's going to be exciting no matter what. Usually, if you hear that a draft is coming, it can be exciting, it can't be exciting, but right now we have the talent to make both shows really strong and TV that you can't miss, and that is always the goal. So thank you all very much for tuning in. I will be back in a couple days chatting about Raw and then telling you what happened at the draft and how well I did. So thanks again so much, everybody, and I'll see you soon.